Sultana. Without any further ado, Dr. Prestholdt.
Thank you. Thanks very much. It's really a pleasure to be here today. I greatly appreciate the invitation to speak with you. And this is, as you mentioned, Harrison, this is a work in progress. But I think that the story of the Sultana, as I'll outline in brief today, is really a fascinating and important story that deserves much more attention. I think this is an ideal venue to offer my reflections on the research that I've done to date. In late April of 1840, a vessel arrived in New York City that was flying a red flag never before seen on American shores. This vessel was the Sultana, the flagship of Sultan Said bin Sultan of Oman and Zanzibar. Now, the Sultana had sailed from Zanzibar, which was at the time the emergent entrepot of East Africa, stopping only briefly on the way at the small island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic, before docking in Lower Manhattan, which was really the heart of America's metropolis. The Sultana was under the command of an Arab emissary with African and Persian officers and an English captain. The crew was both South Asian and East African. In its hold, the ship carried iconic Indian Ocean products: Omani dates, Zanzibari clothes, some of the first Zanzibari clothes exported to the U.S., East African ivory, Yemeni coffee, and Persian carpets, among other things. So in many ways, the Sultana was a microcosm of the Western Indian Ocean world at the time, of Zanzibar specifically, and Oman. Just as important, the Sultana evidenced the Sultan's and the Sultanette's direct engagement with world regions, both within and, in the case of New York, beyond the Indian Ocean region. And it also evidenced the Sultanette's interest in strengthening ties with the United States, specifically with the U.S. as an emerging economic power in the 19th century. In short, the Sultana was in many ways a testament to Oman-Zanzibar's attempts to shape the emerging global relationships of the 19th century. This, by the way, is an image of the Sultana, certainly the most detailed image I've been able to find, of another mission, economic and diplomatic mission to London, very soon after its mission to New York City. So this is an image from 1842. The Sultana very quickly became a spectacle in New York City, which is one of the reasons why we have so much information about it. It made headlines, not just in New York, but actually right across the U.S. I've seen papers from all over America with stories about the Sultana in that spring and summer of 1840. In fact, crowds gathered almost daily around the ship, a ship that one reporter called, quote, the celebrated Arab ship. The vice president, the governor of New York State, and many other dignitaries paid visits to the ship. The primary focus throughout the spring and summer of 1840, while the ship was in New York, was the chief of the mission, Ahmed bin Ahmad al-Kabi, whose career in many ways was emblematic of the historical shifts that we see in the 19th century Western Indian Ocean region. So let me just say a word about him. I also want to say a word about the portrait itself. But let me say a word about him, a biographical note by way of introduction. Nahman was born in the Persian Gulf. He studied in Bombay, gained fluency in English as a result, and then served as the secretary to Sultan Said. He lived much of his life in Zanzibar, and he acted as the Sultan's envoy, not just to the United States, as we know, but also to England, also to Egypt, and to China as well. So he had a quite long and illustrious career. In New York City, in 1840, however, he would captivate audiences in a way translating Oman and Zanzibar for American audiences, and actually receiving many, many invitations, which is a point I'll return to a bit later. Giving many public speeches, and again, making headlines across the US. In fact, so great was the interest in Nahman and the visit of the Sultana that very soon after its arrival, in fact, the New York City Common Council commissioned this portrait at actually great expense to be painted of Nahman. I'll come back to talk about this portrait and the details of the portrait, because I think the details are actually very important. Before going any further, I want to address a very important question. This was the first, either Arab or African vessel to visit the United States. I want to address a really critical question, and that's why. Why did the Sultan of Oman and Zanzibar send this ship, particularly in 1840? Why 1840 and why to New York? Why not to Washington, D.C., for instance? And to understand this, to answer this question, we need a little bit of background. From the late 18th century, the fortunes of the Sultanate of Oman and Zanzibar were rising significantly. For instance, increased commercial activity had transformed Zanzibar, a small island off the East African coast, into a burgeoning island city that after 1840, in fact, very soon after the Sultana returned to Zanzibar, would become the kind of de facto capital of the Sultanate, because Said Said would spend much of his time there until close to the end of his life. So this transoceanic Sultanate would have a very important seat of political power in East Africa, as well as in Muscat. This, by the way, is just a detail, really the only other image that I found of the Sultana, which was, of course, pictured in the background of that image, that painting of Nahman. Now, the concentration of economic activity at Zanzibar facilitated, or in some cases strengthened, ties with the East African interior, with Oman, with South Asia, with Europe, and the Americas, while drawing diverse residents and diverse merchants to both Zanzibar and Muscat. In the 1830s, merchants from across Eastern Africa, Southern Arabia, South Asia, North America, Western Europe, and elsewhere traded at Zanzibar. Actually, let me show you this too before I move on. This is, as far as I know, one of the earliest photographs of Muscat from about 1859, 1860. And you can see many vessels very similar to the Sultana in the harbor here. I'll go back to another image of Muscat in a moment. But this is essentially what the Sultanate of Oman and Zanzibar looked like at the time. In the mid-19th century, you can see Oman to the right, with the capital at Muscat, and in red, indicated on the left from this 19th century map, is the realm of the Sultanate, which was actually quite extensive by 1840 when the Sultana visited the United States. All the way down from the north to Somalia, all the way down to the border with the border with Mozambique in the south. Here's just an image of Zanzibar at the time, roughly at the time in the 1840s, and a rare image of actually, in this case, a British merchant in Zanzibar at mid-century. So a little bit later than the time the Sultana sailed with Zanzibari merchants. By the time the Sultana sailed for New York City, Zanzibar had become the primary regional supply supplier of diverse goods, and really the most important regional marketplace for East African exports, including things like ivory that would be exported to the United States. South Asian, Southern Arabian, and East African merchants dominated the Zanzibari market, but in the early decades of the 19th century, Americans found a unique economic niche in East Africa. Americans had a hard time trading in many of the other places of British dominance or French dominance in the Indian Ocean, but Zanzibar opened the door to kind of American niche trade in the Western Indian Ocean region, in part because Americans were trading American manufactured cotton cloth, which became very popular in both East Africa and Southern Arabia. It's just an image of Zanzibar before we move on. The island of Zanzibar, Zanzibar town, central left, and these are, again, some of the earliest images that we have. These are from the 1840s of the Sultan's residence at Mtoni on Zanzibar Island. So, America was exporting cotton cloth to East Africa. And I'll get to this in a moment, but that's primarily what the Sultana returned from New York with. Massachusetts-made cotton cloth. This was one of the engines of the regional, the whole of the East African, and to a degree even the Southern Arabian economy in terms of import goods. In fact, so important was the Western Indian Ocean to the American cotton cloth industry, of course, the bedrock of American industrialization, that this, not so long after the Sultana sailed to the United States, the first steam-powered textile mill in the United States was built in part by people who had invested in the East African, the Omani Zanzibari market. So anyway, this is an image from Salem, Massachusetts, which had particularly close connections with the Western Indian Ocean. In fact, merchants from Salem, Massachusetts would become so important in East Africa for the American trade that part of the reason for the mission to New York City was to bypass the kind of power that merchants from Salem held in the American trade with the Western Indian Ocean, a point to which I will return in a moment. In fact, by the end of the 1830s, American vessels from Salem made up actually the majority of Western ships in Zanzibar. Now also in the 1830s, U.S. Omani-Zanzibari trade was of growing import to both states. And this precipitated an official treaty of free trade in 1833 between Oman and the United States. Here's just another image of Muscat from that same time period. The end of the 1850s, a little bit later than when the Sultana sailed, but actually some of the earliest images that we have. Now, when this commercial treaty went into effect in 1834, it granted the Sultanate of Oman and Zanzibar, quote-unquote, most favored nation status, which was quite significant in terms of trade. Thereafter, the Sultanate's relationship with American merchants would become actually quite complex. And the Sultan, Said Said, saw the potential of other trade initiatives as well, and actually wanted to take full advantage of the terms of this new treaty, which exempted the Sultanate from import duties in American ports, hence the desire to send his own ships to America. Moreover, he wished to augment Zanzibar's unidirectional relationship with the United States by sending, again, his own vessels to the U.S., which would very clearly ensure great benefits. And in fact, if you read the correspondence of American merchants, they were quite concerned about the fact that the Sultan could send his own ships, because it meant he could buy American goods much cheaper than Americans were selling American goods in the Western Indian Ocean. In fact, the early 19th century actually saw the robust development of the Sultan's and the Sultanet's multi-directional trade initiatives. And this is kind of the larger point that I want to make today, is that yes, there was direct trade between the United States, between Western Europe and Oman-Zanzibar. But some of that was actually on Oman-Zanzibar's own terms. Was direct trade initiated by Oman-Zanzibar. So this was an extension of a wider vision, both to exert greater control over the Sultanate's global economic relationships and also to raise its international profile. It's an important thing to remember about the mission of the Sultana. It was both to trade, but also to essentially demonstrate to New Yorkers, as again the economic hub of the United States, the quality of goods in the Sultanate's realm, or that were traded through Muscat and Zanzibar. Now, all of this was contingent to a degree on the Sultanate's maritime capacity. So let me say a word about that. And again, this is why I want to show the image of Muscat Harbor from roughly this time. Because most of the fleet of the Sultanate was actually dhows. And when I say dhows, I'm referring to a very diverse array of Western Indian Ocean vessels that had long been the backbone of Indian Ocean trade. In fact, Omani dhows traveled not just to East Africa and to Madagascar, but actually as far as the Bay of Bengal in the Eastern Indian Ocean, to Java in contemporary Indonesia, so right across the whole of the Indian Ocean region. That's only one dimension, actually, of the Sultanate's maritime capacity, because it also had many Western-style ships like the Sultana, frigates, brigs, corvettes, great diversity of Western-style vessels up to 1,000 tons, which is substantially larger than the Sultana was. What happened is that the Sultan commissioned these vessels from places as far away as the United States, but more commonly from India, from Bombay, from Cochin, and many other places around the world. So in the 1830s, with the Sultanate's consolidation of this long coast of East Africa, the consolidation of power along the Swahili coast in the 1830s, the Sultan began converting a lot of warships to trade vessels and sending these primarily between Oman and Zanzibar, Zanzibar and Bombay, Oman and Calcutta, and so forth, across the Western Indian Ocean region. So the Sultana, if we look at it more specifically, going back to this image from 1842, Sultana was actually built in India. It was built in Bombay, but a Western-style vessel. It would visit Mauritius in the southwestern Indian Ocean. It would visit Calcutta in eastern South Asia. And it actually, before it sailed to New York, traveled very regularly between Muscat and Zanzibar. New York, however, offered new opportunities for Zanzibari trade and the leading merchants of Zanzibar, because it would allow them to circumvent the strength that American traders held in the exchange between the U.S. and Oman and Zanzibar. Essentially, as I mentioned a moment ago, sending the Sultana to the United States or sending it to London, as we saw very soon thereafter, would allow the Sultanate to buy, the Sultan and his traders, his merchants, to buy goods at a much cheaper price at their source, essentially. So, the Sultan in the 1830s and 1840s sought both to take advantage of diplomatic relations and to impress specifically upon New Yorkers the quality of Western Indian Ocean goods. And before departing, Ahmed bin Ahmed commissioned a British captain to take the ship to New York, and actually traveled to Bombay to recruit sailors there, a crew of over 50. But one of the interesting parts of the story is the Sultana almost didn't make it to New York. This was, of course, a very long journey that no one in that none of his ships had made before. And what happened is that the ship stopped at St. Helena. This was Jamestown in the 1840s, a very small island in in the southern Atlantic Ocean. And the English captain who he had hired was a drunkard. When he was in Jamestown, drank the whole time, became essentially unconscious when they were set to leave. And so the only thing that saved the Sultana on its outward journey was the fact that while it had been in Jamestown, Nahman had overheard conversations amongst various captains about the best route to New York. And he remembered these conversations, and so essentially, while the captain was incapacitated for about a week, the Sultana sailed north towards New York without a captain, just on the memory of these conversations that Nahman overheard. So it's quite remarkable. And it made it safely to New York City. After an 87-day journey. So after 87 days, the Sultana arrives in New York City. And for the next few months, the ship would captivate the United States. New Yorkers, in fact, flocked to the wharf to get a glimpse of the ship and its crew. This is just a sort of contemporary image of Lower Manhattan. You can see ships docked just in the background. In fact, newspaper reports, which are really fascinating from the time, because all the newspapers in New York covered stories about the Sultana and the movement of the crew, the movement of the envoy, they recounted how the pier was actually so overcrowded that the sailors of the Sultana were, quote unquote, this is from a newspaper at the time, almost killed by the pushing and pressing and squeezing of the mobs, end quote. People were so keen to see the ship and the crew. In fact, hundreds of visitors clamored to get on board. And you can see this is an image of the wharf at the time. It already was a somewhat chaotic place and busy place. Now, Nahman very quickly sold the cargo, almost immediately sold the cargo, and loaded about 90,000 yards of American cloth, so a pretty substantial amount. This is just an image of East African ivory, which is one of the major elements of the cargo. The American demand for ivory was actually very large and would continue. accept these kinds of gifts. Many in Congress argued that this was the action of a monarch, and a democratically elected president absolutely couldn't accept gifts from a foreign leader. Now, interestingly, Congress ultimately passed a bill to authorize the president's acceptance of the gifts. And the former president, John Quincy Adams, then led a counteroffensive to overturn this bill. So there was a lot of congressional wrangling specifically about the gifts from Said. Now, ultimately, what happened is that the horses were sold to Virginia, to wealthy individuals in Virginia and Tennessee, and most of the gifts were deposited at the Department of State, so it was a sort of diplomatic solution. Obviously, Angelica and Buren used the pearls for a time, and they changed hands many, many times over the course of the next more than 100 years, passing between different government agencies. Some of these gifts actually, this is an aside, were stolen and then recovered. So the gifts themselves are a fascinating history in their own right. Now, to the city, New Yorkers were so fascinated with the mission and with Ahmed bin Monokabi that soon after his arrival, as I mentioned, the New York City Common Council commissioned his portrait, and didn't just commission a portrait at great expense, but displayed it in City Hall with the intention that all could come in and view it for many, many years. And I want to say a word about this image, because I think it, in a surprising way, faithfully captured the elite fashion of 1840 Muscat and Zanzibar. And what it did is it juxtaposed it with an image of the Sultana, albeit a very, very small image, but one of the few images that we have, framed it with this kind of neoclassical window and a kind of neoclassical background. But I think this speaks to the way in which the Sultana reflected a kind of, or the image reflected a kind of fascination, but also in many ways, it's a romantic image that is, in some ways, relatively positive, which isn't always the way in which Westerners represented Oman and Zanzibar, particularly in the latter 19th century. So this relatively positive light in which New York's elite viewed the envoy, his vessel, and the mission, is, I think, gives us a certain window into U.S. Omani-Zanzibari relations at the time. Now, Nahman and his lieutenants had a very full schedule while they were in New York, because in many ways, like the Sultan of Zanzibar and Oman wanted to impress Americans, New Yorkers wanted to impress the envoy and ultimately the Sultan of Oman-Zanzibar. He was taken to ride on actually multiple railroads being sort of the high technology of the West at this point in time. He was taken to visit a public hospital, which again was sort of a highlight of New York at the time. He was treated to a formal dinner at City Hall, taken on a tour of the Brooklyn Navy Yard, tours of many, many other facilities, many other places in the New York City area. Mayors, city leaders, naval commodores, and ultimately even the vice president paid visits to the Sultana. So not only was it receiving a lot of attention from the press, but it was receiving significant attention from political leaders. But just before the Sultana was meant to leave, days before it was supposed to leave, a terrible storm hit New York City. And in fact, lightning hit the Sultana directly. And the damages were immense, shattering one of its masts, basically debilitating the vessel. The interesting thing is the state response was overwhelming, immediate, and quite positive. The Navy received orders from Washington, D.C. to refit the Sultana all at the US government's expense, including giving it a new mast. And in fact, Nahman and the crew, his lieutenants as well as the whole crew, became guests of the US Navy in Brooklyn. In fact, an Ohio congressman announced that he intended to introduce a bill to Congress that would authorize the government not just to fix the Sultana, but to present the Sultan of Oman and Zanzibar with an entirely new ship. So there was a very strong sense of goodwill, and also the idea that this represented a new opportunity for New York-based merchants to engage with the Western Indian Ocean. So again, this is both a diplomatic and commercial interest set sort of coming together. Ultimately, Nahman hired a new captain, an American captain from Philadelphia, for the return journey and departed with a refitted ship. They stopped in Cape Town. This is an image from about that time. Cape Town, South Africa, en route to Zanzibar, and then arrived back in Zanzibar later in 1840. Now, the denouement to the story is that the Sultana wouldn't return to the US. But I think the important point here is that what happened with the New York City mission, this economic and diplomatic mission, is that it dramatically accelerated Oman-Zanzibar's outward projection. So in many ways, while the Sultan didn't send another vessel to New York City, it was just the beginning of a dramatic expansion of Oman and Zanzibar's global projection. And that's what I want to end with today. That in 1842, the Sultana again sailed to Britain. I should say the Sultana sailed to Britain very soon after sailing to the United States with horses, as we saw, and other gifts for Queen Victoria. Later missions to London, to Marseille, to elsewhere in Europe cultivated deeper relationships with the Atlantic and the Mediterranean. In fact, Nahman himself continued to represent the Sultan, including as a long-term representative to Réunion, a French-controlled island in the southwestern Indian Ocean. And after his return from New York, Nahman became a staunch supporter of favorable relations with the U.S. In fact, he became a key member of what came to be known in the Sultanate as the quote-unquote American faction. These were advisors to the Sultan who lobbied hard for closer relations with the United States as a kind of buttress against the increasing British power in the Persian Gulf and in the Indian Ocean more generally. This is a really interesting, important era in Omani-Zanzibari history, because they saw Nahman and others in this American faction of sort of merchants and diplomatic elite of Oman and Zanzibar. They saw in the United States an alternative in terms of global relations to that with Britain, which was attempting to increase its control in the region, its influence, I should say, in the region. And in fact, Nahman held this position until, as far as I know, until his death in 1870. So he was always, from that point in time on, from 1840s on, a strong proponent of close relations with the United States, specifically. Now, after Said Said's death in 1856, his successors continued to dispatch ships. And this is why the Sultana's story is really just a beginning to a much longer story of Omani-Zanzibari relations with the wider world, the wider, both Indian Ocean world and Atlantic world, and even beyond. By the way, this is an image from Zanzibar of Ahmed bin Nahman's grave in Zanzibar town. As I mentioned, Said Said's successors continued to dispatch ships to London, to Marseille, as I mentioned, but also to Bombay and throughout the Indian Ocean. They also ventured to other ports. Here's an image of Zanzibar slightly later, the 1860s, as the city grew actually exponentially at mid-century. Sultan of Zanzibar, after Said Said, his son Majid, sent vessels to Istanbul, to Hamburg, and we actually know quite a bit about one of these vessels, Al-Majidi, which Majid sent to Hamburg around 1870. Because Majid's sister, Salma binti Said, who married a German merchant and lived in Hamburg for quite some time, wrote about sailors from the Majidi knocking on her door and giving her news about Zanzibar, about current events in Zanzibar and Muscat. So the Majidi's visit to Hamburg occasioned some interest as well. And in fact, as far as I know, these are the earliest images that we have of sailors on either Omani or Zanzibari ships. This is an image from 1870, 1871 from Hamburg. One of the sailors, Abdullah, is the only name given. Another sailor whose name was given as Varhen, who was a crew member of the Majidi on its visit to Hamburg in 1870. So these missions became much more, these trading ventures became much more regular, in fact. Sultan Bargash bin Said of Zanzibar in 1875 took this one step further, in fact. He himself visited the UK and France in 1875. And in fact, Bargash's visit to London and to Paris occasioned even more interest than the Sultana's several decades earlier. There's a lot of information on this. Is from one of the illustrated London magazines. It's depicting Bargash visiting all these different places, visiting railroads, visiting, stepping off an elevator. This is what the image in the center. This actually was meant to strengthen, again, ties between, in this case, Zanzibar and the UK. And Bargash, much like his father, attempted to capitalize on the attention that the visit received to basically raise the profile of his sultanate and to promote trade. And that was his primary interest, or one of his primary interests, to promote trade with East Africa at that time. He also dramatically expanded his father's commercial vision by purchasing German and Scottish steamships and establishing a direct steamship service between Zanzibar and Bombay. Bombay being kind of the rising industrial heart of the Western Indian Ocean in the 1870s. This was actually quite important because it regularized transoceanic traffic, and not for the very first time, but in the 1870s, this is still very early on, freeing Indian Ocean travel from the rhythms of the monsoon. Steamships could travel all year round as frequently as possible, bringing significant revenues to Zanzibar's coffers. So let me just conclude by saying a couple words about the legacy of the Sultana. Well, one legacy is, of course, that it's remembered. These are postage stamps from the Sultanate of Oman, one from 1986, the other from 1990, depicting Said Said, Ahmad bin Nahman, as well as the vessel, as well as the ship itself. But perhaps more than any single vessel, the Sultana, in its journey to the United States, evidenced Oman-Zanzibar's initiative in charting its own economic course in an era of increasing interdependence, but also an era of increasing European imperial expansion. In fact, the Sultana explored the possibility of multi-directional trade
between the Indian Ocean and the Atlantic, something that no one had done before, wherein, in this case, Omani-Zanzibari vessels delivered delivered African, Arabian, and Asian products to foreign shores, to very distant shores, in this case, the U.S. And in this way, the Sultana was part of a wider and highly ambitious strategy of global projection and economic engagement. Now, these efforts didn't fundamentally change the increasingly uneven or unequal global economic relationships that were emerging in the mid-19th century. But the Sultana's voyage was one of the earliest attempts by the Sultanate of Oman and Zanzibar to expand its relationships with states well beyond the Indian Ocean region, while also bolstering economic ties with those states. And in this way, the Sultana's journey to New York and many other journeys, like Al-Majidi and others, both within and beyond the Indian Ocean world, evidenced global economic networks shaped not just by the actions and the interest of powerful European states, and other states like the United States, but also by the interest and enterprise of other, and in some cases, less powerful states and actors like the Sultanate of Oman and Zanzibar. I'll stop there.